Evening, everybody. Good morning for those following us from the US, and good afternoon for those in Europe. Thank you very much for joining us today. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Pierce Salguero, who's joining us. He's a prolific author, um, researcher, conference convener, educator, and really prolific, amazing amount of works he's been editing and writing. So it's a pleasure to invite him today to talk about Buddhist medicine. So I won't say much more. Pierce, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Jamyang, and hello, everybody. It's good to see you all there. I'm just quickly taking a look at the names and seeing how many people I know here, and it's not too many, so it's great to be talking to a new group of people. And thank you so much for the invitation to do so. And I'm gonna get my little screen share, get my PowerPoint going here. So just give me 1 second to pull that up. All right. Good. So yeah, like Jamyang was saying, I've been involved in a lot of different ways in kind of the intersection between Buddhism and medicine for the last 30 years or so, since I was in my young 20s. I started out as both a meditator and also a student of traditional medicine while I was living in Thailand. After many years, I gravitated more and more towards academic study, and eventually came back to the US, where I have been living since I was a child, and entered into graduate school and started studying the intersection between Buddhism and medicine from a more historical and academic perspective. So I have a PhD in the history of medicine from Johns Hopkins University. And I have been, for the last maybe 20 years or so, much more firmly planted in the academic study of this topic than in the practice. I haven't been a practitioner, a professional practitioner, for many years. So I know or I'm assuming that many of you may have come to this presentation because of an interest in practice, an interest in the practical applications of the things that I'm going to talk about. And I just want to warn you in advance that that's not really my focus. So this talk isn't going to be so much about how to do healing, but rather to look at this topic through the lens of a historian, look at the history of the intersections between Buddhism and medicine, and what we know about those intersections, and what looking at those intersections can tell us about Buddhism more broadly and about medicine more broadly. So that's kind of my agenda for today. Yeah, so welcome, and hopefully you enjoy. And when it comes to the presentation, I'm going to talk for a little while, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And maybe at that point we can expand a little bit out beyond the topics that I talk about here. If you have questions about other aspects of things that I've done in the past, or things that maybe on your mind, we can maybe open out a little bit. So I'll just start off by kind of giving you a sense of the overall range of things that I've been studying as an academic, the kinds of things that I'm able to talk about. I know you all are primarily interested in Tibetan medicine, Tibetan Buddhism, and these are not areas that I'm very familiar with. So my own publication track record starts on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here. In terms of academic publications, my first one was a small book on traditional Thai medicine, and the way that it's informed by Buddhism, animism, yoga, Ayurveda, and other forms of Asian religion and medicine kind of combined together in Thai medicine. When I was in graduate school, I switched from studying Thailand to studying medieval China. And so my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, and then my first book were on the translation of Buddhist medicine in medieval China, looking at how Indian medicine that was embedded in Buddhist scriptures was translated into Chinese in the medieval period, and how Chinese people understood and related to those ideas and practices. From there, I have also started to collect works written by other scholars. And so this Buddhist Healing in Medieval China and Japan book is one example of an edited volume of writings by myself and other scholars. Finally, at the bottom of the screen, I also wanted to mention that I've been running a ethnographic survey project in the city of Philadelphia in the US. Philadelphia is an interesting city. It's much smaller than New York. However, it still has a very representative Buddhist population. We have a lot of Asian immigrants in the city. And consequently, it's sort of like a microcosm of the Buddhist world. You can find basically a temple affiliated with pretty much every major form of Buddhism in the world in Philadelphia. And so this project was active up until 2020 when the pandemic caused us to shut it down. But I have students who speak multiple Asian languages out in the field doing surveys and research on the many ways that Buddhists today are involved in healthcare, healing practices and activities. So that website, jivaka.net, has a series of documentary films that I was involved in producing, as well as a sort of location finder with all of the temples in Philadelphia and their connections with medicine. So that's kind of a range of things that I will not be talking about today. Today, my focus is on sort of the top part of this slide here, which is a 3-book series from Columbia University Press that has just culminated in 2022. So this was probably a 9.5 year project, I guess, to put this together. The first book, actually they're out of order. The first book is the one in the middle, the Buddhism and Medicine Anthology. Jamyang has a chapter in there too. And this was a collection of translations produced by scholars all over the world of all sorts of texts that are related to Buddhism and medicine from the premodern period. Next, in 2019, the book on the left came out, which is a continuation of the anthology that moves into the modern and contemporary period. So altogether, these 2 volumes, these 2 anthologies represent the work of 85 or 86 scholars, and there's 97 chapters. So 97, and some of those chapters have more than one text translated in them. So there's well over 100 texts that are translated from across the Buddhist world that relate to all kinds of healthcare, all kinds of ideas about medicine. These 2 books are pretty expensive. They're library volumes. You know, academic presses sometimes produce books that are just only intended for the academic library market. But you know, many of these chapters are circulating online, and if you have an interest in any of these materials, you can certainly get your hands on them. And if you can't, just maybe email me or Jamyang, and we can hook you up. In any event, the most recent publication is the one on the right of the top row here, and this is a book called The Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. And this is it's what I'm mainly going to be talking about today. And this book is, in many ways, I think, a summary, a synthesis of all of the work that's on the screen here. So this book, fortunately, yes, we did publish an expensive university library hardcover, but it's also been published in softcover, paperback, for $30 in the US, so equivalent, you know, in other places. So that's fairly affordable as far as academic books go. And there was also, when I was writing it, there was an intent to write it in a way that was very accessible for, you know, it's probably not the book to give to somebody who knows nothing about Buddhism or doesn't really care about Asian medicine. Because there is some background knowledge that's assumed that you know about, you know, basic Buddhist ideas and so forth. However, it is intended to be accessible to a wide range of interested readers. And what I've tried to do in this book is to really summarize my research and experiences in Thailand and medieval China, all of the, as well as in Philadelphia, so all of the academic work that I've been doing, I summarize and cite and sort of weave together all of the contributions that the authors made to the anthologies. And then I draw together and cite and discuss all of the literature that pretty much every scholar has written for the last 50 years on the subject of Buddhism and medicine. I missed some things here and there, I'm sure, but it really was an attempt to very broadly summarize this huge field and make sense of all of this work that has been done kind of in separate silos. Like the Tibetanists talk to the Tibetanists, and the Chinese scholars talk to the Chinese scholars. And this was an attempt to sort of like really pull all of this information together into one coherent sort of big story about the relationship between Buddhism and medicine. Where does it originate? How does it develop over time? How does it become modernized? How is it practiced? How are these ideas practiced and understood in various parts of Asia? And then as Buddhism becomes globalized, modernized, in the contemporary period, how are these ideas and practices still continuing to shape both Buddhism and healthcare today? So the book approaches Buddhism and health in what I call a global and historical perspective. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through some of the things that I talk about in more detail in the book, but just to give you sort of an outline of what we're talking about here. So the first point is that from the very earliest times, the very earliest texts that we have from any Buddhist tradition, it's apparent that already medicine was a part of the discourse. So this is true of early Sanskrit texts. It's true of the early Pali texts. In the Pali canon, for example, there are many mentions of medical ideas, particularly when it comes to discussions of meditation. So analysis of the body. The terminology used for the body is frequently paralleled in the medical literature. The analysis of the body according to the 4 elements, for example, the language there is very similar to texts from Ayurveda, from ancient Indian medicine. And there also are various kinds of healing practices that are mentioned in the Pali Canon related to ritual healing, but also a whole range of different herbal treatments, surgical treatments, and other kinds of medical interventions. When Buddhism begins to expand beyond India, and it really expands in by the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, so the year 1000. By that time, Buddhism has spread. I'm sure you know this, but Buddhism has spread everywhere from what today is Iran all the way to Japan, and what today is Mongolia or even Siberia, all the way down to Indonesia. So a huge expanse of Asia, at one point is predominantly Buddhist. Now, Islam replaces and Hinduism replaces Buddhism in certain parts of Asia, but many of those parts of Asia remain Buddhist beyond the first millennium CE. But we can think of this time period as a period in which the ideas and the practices that are embedded within these Indian Buddhist texts are introduced to the rest of the world. As these texts are spread beyond India, they're translated into Chinese and into Tibetan and into other languages. Even when they're not linguistically translated, the ideas are culturally translated. So in places like Myanmar and Thailand, where the Pali scriptures are chanted in Pali, the ideas that they contain are explained in local languages. So these, include, of course, all sorts of Buddhist philosophical and moral and practice-related doctrines. But along the way, a lot of the medical material that we see embedded in the Buddhist canon is also translated into these languages. The Buddhist canon is not the only kind of Buddhist text that is transported in this way and translated in this way. There are many kinds of oral stories, oral teachings, many kinds of other documents that are not scriptures, but are commentaries or instruction manuals, or even in many cases there are medical manuals that are held within monastic libraries, and all of these texts, all of the medical information across all of these texts is circulating around Asia in the same way that the Buddhist doctrines and practices are. So during this time period, we also see the movement of a lot of goods between circulating around Asia. This is the period of time in which the Silk Roads are major networks of cross-cultural communication. And so we see not only ritual manuals or medical manuals that tell you how to implement certain kinds of herbal medicines, but you also see the herbal medicines, the material themselves circulating throughout Asia. And a lot of times this is very closely related to Buddhist institutions. So in East Asia, for example, and also in Tibetan cultures, monasteries often served as dispensaries, and so they collected and warehoused medicines. They dispensed medicines to the population in times of epidemics and so forth. Certainly the ritual officiants at important temples were acquiring the proper medications to be used in certain rituals. And so there was this, you could say, a Pan-Asian medical marketplace where these medicines were circulating throughout the region. In addition to medicines, we've talked about texts and medicines, other kinds of material objects that were circulating in the first millennium. In addition, people were circulating. So this is a period of time in which we have historical records of many dozens of people who lived in one place and decided to travel around the Buddhist world in order specifically to collect knowledge and bring it back home. So frequently that knowledge that they're really interested in is scriptures. So Chinese, famous Chinese pilgrims, for example, Xuanzang and Yijing and Faxian, that they went in search of missing scriptures that they would bring back to China. But in many cases, these same individuals, we have record of them bringing back medical information as well. So Yijing, one of the pilgrims I just mentioned from China, 7th century, travels to Nalanda in India, spends some time there, and brings back a report on Indian monastic medical practice, Indian monastic daily health regimens and so forth, which he writes in Chinese, and it becomes part of the Chinese Buddhist tradition. That's just one example. There's many examples: Japanese monks traveling to China, South Asian monks going up onto the Silk Roads, Chinese monks going to Cambodia. There's a sort of a whole circulation of people in this period as well. And they're meeting each other in Buddhist context, in monastic contexts, and they're living together in these monasteries. And the monasteries have, like any institution where lots of people live and pass through, they're going to have medical clinics, and they're going to have, specialists in medicine. And so I think of this period as this period of time where this network of exchange is really thriving all around Asia. This network of exchange of medical information, which really is being driven largely by Buddhists, by Buddhist people, Buddhist ideas, Buddhist institutions. In a way, this is much more of a cosmopolitan picture of medicine in this period than we have if we just think about there's traditional medicine in China, Ayurveda in India, Sowa Rigpa in Tibet, right? And we think of these as very separate systems. This period of time, the first millennium, is a period of time where there's a lot of flow and cross-pollination between India, China, the Himalayas, Southeast Asia. and really the rest of the world, because there's a lot of also European and Islamic medicine that's coming in to the region as well in this period. So following the historical trajectory of the book, the next millennium, the second millennium, so that's, you know, the year 1000 until 1999, the real highlight for us, I mean, the circulation of knowledge continues in this period, but the real highlight, or what's different in this period, is the development of regional traditions that become very distinct from one another over time. So that Chinese Buddhist medicine looks quite different from Tibetan Buddhist medicine, which looks quite different from Southeast Asian Buddhist medicine. So I talk in this book about there being multiple, in different regions of Asia, that there's different trajectories for what happens with Buddhist medicine. So in one part of Asia, Buddhism is replaced by Islam and Hinduism. And in those parts of Asia, you know, Western Asia, Northern India, Indonesia, Buddhist religion is suppressed or dies out, and Buddhist and overtly Buddhist healing practices are not celebrated in nearly the way that they were before. There is some evidence in the anthology. There's one chapter that shows that some of the healing practices being done by contemporary Muslim practitioners in Bengal, they do these mantra chants, and the scholar who was translated in the anthology shows that these mantras actually originate in Vajrayana Buddhism. So there are some remnants like that that are sort of like under the radar, but for the most part, overtly Buddhist medicine kind of dies out in this period in those parts of Asia. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the whole sort of tradition of Buddhism in East Asia goes through a process of what I call domestication, which is it's a term from translation studies that talks about how ideas that were originally foreign from India really become filtered through the dominant local culture. And this happens with Buddhism more generally. And so you get traditions in China like Zen that are very East Asian in their flavor. But you also see this happening with Buddhist medicine. So that in the second millennium, so in the first millennium, during this Pan-Asian sort of circulation phase, you have a lot of Chinese Buddhists that are really interested in India, like I Ching. They're interested in what are they doing in the Indian monasteries. They're interested in Indian medicine. They're interested in understanding these terms, these foreign concepts from India. In the second millennium, Buddhist medicine becomes a lot more domesticated. So you are much more likely to see people speaking in terms of qi and yin yang and these other kinds of native East Asian terms when it comes to health and well-being. And so in this period, you have the emergence of certain centers, like the Shaolin Temple, for example, is a very famous center for East Asian Buddhist medicine. And in places like this, they're very much practicing within a Chinese cultural context. And Buddhism and Buddhist healing practices in this period in China, similarly in other parts of East Asia, are drawing much more on the local culture than they are interested in foreign inputs from India or elsewhere. Finally, there's a third region that I talk about in the book, which is sort of maybe the middle ground between West Asia and East Asia. So this is kind of a strip from Mongolia through Tibet, the Himalayas, down into Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia. And in that part of Asia, this is the part of Asia that remains very much Buddhist to this day, and also doesn't go through this process of domestication in nearly the extent that East Asia does. And so in these parts, you have the continuation of these Indian concepts that were introduced in the first millennium, and development of those concepts to form local traditions of Buddhist medicine that continue to this day. So it's in this period that Sowa Rigpa really becomes Sowa Rigpa. It's in this period that Thai medicine emerges. Khmer medicine in Cambodia. You have Burmese medicine in Myanmar. These are traditions that are of medicine. In all cases, they share origin in an Indian medical theory. They draw on local traditions, maybe draw in some Chinese ideas as well, but they really are primarily Indian in their theoretical structure, but they are overtly Buddhist. So obviously in the Sowa Rigpa tradition, the whole tradition is attributed to the medicine Buddha. In Thailand, it's attributed to a series of Buddhist sages and the Buddha's doctor, Jivaka. So there will be these Buddhist kind of heroes or Buddhist deities or Buddhist doctors that are attributed with being the source of that healing knowledge. So finally, then, in the modern period, which for the purposes of this book, I'm talking about the 19th to the 21st century, we have a radical transformation of the Buddhist the relationship between Buddhism and medicine. And this is due to the widespread adoption of scientific worldviews around the world, and the need for both Buddhism and traditional medicine to reform and transform themselves in light of this new scientific kind of worldview. So the history of Buddhism and its transformations and modernization is something, that perhaps you all are familiar with from work of other scholars. In my field, in the field of history of medicine in Asia, there's a whole other set of literature that talks about the modernization process of Asian medicine. And Buddhist medicine, kind of sitting at the nexus of these two, Buddhism and medicine, is no exception to this process of modernization. Briefly, the kind of main idea of this time period is that in the earlier portion of this period in the 19th century, in the context of colonialism, you have European efforts to resist or to defund or to, in some cases, eradicate traditional medicine in the colonies and replace it with what was considered to be superior scientific medicine. Insofar as Buddhists were involved in healing in that period, they experienced this repression as well. However, by the end of this period, by the late 20th into the 21st century, there has been a resurgence or a revival of Asian medicine and of Buddhist healing practices in particular, coming back into some degree of acceptance among the scientific community. And even in certain cases, certain practices are very enthusiastically embraced by the scientific community. The biggest, most clear example of that is mindfulness meditation, which is now kind of like everywhere, and a very intense point of interest for scientific investigation. But there are other Buddhist healing interventions that have also been looked at through scientific lenses as well, including things like energy healing or kaji in Japan, or Naikan, which is another kind of meditation or contemplative practice in Japan. Certain aspects of Sowa Rigpa have been certainly researched through a scientific lens. And so kind of the transition in the modern period is one from, the initial repression of these practices to now sort of an increasing interest globally in these practices. Once they're kind of validated by science, they become of interest across the world, and people start to share knowledge and share teachings about this on YouTube, and then it becomes part of social media, and it really starts spreading very rapidly around the world. And so today, in 2022, you're able to go online and find information really about Buddhist healing interventions of all kinds. If you're limited only by the languages that you're able to speak, because there's tons and tons and tons of material out there in Asian languages on YouTube and other sites related to health and healing. Much of this interaction is happening in English these days. So if you're able to read English, you're able to access a lot of this material. But what I'm pointing to in this kind of broad history that I've just laid out is a long scale, many centuries long and global phenomenon that I am labeling as Buddhist medicine. So this term is used in some places, in some historical contexts, to refer to certain medical practices or ideas. But I'm using Buddhist medicine. So you may have heard Buddhist medicine before, maybe in relation to like specifically Sowa Rigpa, or specifically in relation to another Buddhist tradition. And I'm using Buddhist medicine in a much broader sense to refer to sort of the whole range of different things that I was just talking about in the previous slide. So from early Indian scriptures through the localization and the changes and transformations all throughout history in different parts of the world, through the modernization process to the contemporary sort of global process, that whole sort of field as Buddhist medicine. When I use that term, I'm not necessarily saying it's all the same thing, that what was done in Tibet in this 8th century is the same as what's being done in Taiwan today. I'm not using this term to create sort of like a simplistic or essentialist kind of model. I'm using the term Buddhist medicine something like you could use the term Buddhist art. So if I was to use the term Buddhist art, I could be referring to things that are really different from one another. A Japanese calligraphy, enso circle is a form of Buddhist art, and so is a cartoon from contemporary Japan, and so is a sculpture from the Silk Roads. These are all examples of Buddhist art from very, very different contexts, and they look differently, and they were made differently, and they have a whole different sort of culture around them. But there's something that they share in common. They're participating in a broader tradition of Buddhist art making. So I'm thinking of Buddhist medicine like that this is a very broad and diverse, constantly changing, very amorphous global phenomenon of Buddhists being involved with medicine. So I don't mean to characterize Buddhist medicine as in an oversimplified way, or try to, I'm not making the argument that there's sort of like one tradition there. Just give you some examples of Buddhist art related to Buddhist medicine from around the world. And in the upper left-hand corner here, you see some images of demons from a scroll, a book in that was recovered from Dunhuang. Today, Dunhuang is in Western China. Dunhuang's changed hands in the past. It was part of Tibetan kingdom at one point, and part of other independent states at certain points. But it's this really fascinating location in the Silk Roads that serves as kind of like a nexus point for different cultures to intermix. Dunhuang, if you're not familiar with this is something you should Google immediately and spend some time looking at. Dunhuang is the location of one of the largest manuscript finds in world history. Tens of thousands, depending on how you count, if you want to count the fragments or the, whole manuscripts or whatever, there's, up to 60,000 manuscripts that were discovered in a cave in a temple in Dunhuang about 120 years ago. And these documents have really revolutionized the history of Asia, the history of Buddhism, basically everything we know about Buddhist medicine really changed due to the discovery of these manuscripts. And there are manuscripts in all sorts of different languages, all kinds of different traditions that relate to health and healing that were discovered as part of this cache. Anyway, these particular texts are what you see here are 5 different grahas, which are the names of these demons that seize. The graha means to seize, so they grab children, infants. These are the demons that are associated with sudden childhood illnesses, infectious diseases, and death. So I don't know how big your screen is, but these figures are humanoid figures with different animal heads. There's a deer and a rooster and a cat and some other animals there. And this text has images of the demons, and then also describes rituals to practice and other kinds of interventions to practice in order to keep the grahas away from your children. Very kind of standard medieval demonology in this text. So over on the right, next is a detail from an image that I'm assuming probably a lot of you are familiar with, these medical tankas that were produced by the regent of the 5th Dalai Lama, Sangye Gyatso, in the 17th and early 18th century. If you're not familiar with this collection, this is a masterful artistic depiction of Tibetan medical arts, or medical practice more generally. It begins with a mandala that depicts the whole lineage of Sowa Rigpa, and it continues through all of the various different kinds of realms of knowledge, including herbal medicines and anatomy, physiology, alchemy, minerals, animals, all sorts of different realms of knowledge and practice that are illustrated and captioned. It's really a beautiful collection of tankas, and it accompanies the medical tradition, the texts of the medical tradition, as it's sort of a teaching tool as well. So this is, it's a really rich source, and I just grabbed one detail of one image here just to maybe have the opportunity to mention the subtle body practices as part of the Buddhist, sort of the realm of Buddhist interventions into health and healing. So this picture in particular is showing a heart chakra and a number of other channels coming off of it. And not to get into a lot of detail there, but just to say that the sort of overall tradition of Buddhist medicine includes a lot of herbal medicine, rituals, different kinds of ritual interventions and so forth, and then a whole range of subtle body practices as well. If we go to the bottom left, this is maybe drawing on a similar kind of body of knowledge of subtle body practices, but here applied to the body through massage or acupressure or pushing, pressing into the body. This is a series of diagrams that are part of the Wat Pratchetipan temple complex, a 19th century temple complex in Bangkok. And these medical artifacts were collected at that location. 1830s is really right at the cusp of when scientific medicine was embraced in Thailand, or in Siam at that time it was called, and started to replace the medical tradition. So it's kind of this these collection of medical artifacts at this temple is kind of a snapshot, right at a critical point in the history of Thai Buddhist medicine. And Siam at that point had just recently reunified a very large territory in Southeast Asia, includes parts of what today is Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia, as well as Thailand. And the royal, this is a royal temple. They collected from all over this newly established kingdom artifacts, and they brought them together and housed them in Bangkok. And they also wrote texts that describe these, they collected texts from around and synthesized them together and put them in a collection. And so you have this sort of like snapshot of Southeast Asian medicine more generally that was produced in Bangkok at that time. Really, really fascinating collection there. And then I just thought I would mention, you know, the existence of or continuing existence of Buddhist centers that relate to health and healing today all over the world. This Land of Medicine Buddha is one that I happened to take a picture of when I was driving by in California many years ago. But you know, there are centers all over the world, not just affiliated with Tibetan Buddhism, but with all forms of Buddhism. We have retreat centers and medical clinics and all sorts of other facilities that are operating today around the world. Many of them are charities run by Buddhist temples, or they're otherwise associated very closely with Buddhist institutions and organizations. So this is just kind of just a snapshot. I wanted to sort of put some specifics to what we were talking about, just a really kind of just a taste of the really wide range of different sorts of things that you know, could qualify as Buddhist medicine over time. So I talked about the diversity. I really wanted to emphasize that you know, the wide range of difference between all of these times and places. Now I'm going to talk about some of the similarities because there are, at the same time, I really want to emphasize that there isn't sort of one tradition of Buddhist medicine around the world. But having compared and looked at all of this, you know, historical material, contemporary material, this really wide range of different cultural interpretations and presentations of this material, I've come to the point where I have identified some things that we could say are sort of like core elements or shared elements of Buddhist medicine. It's not to say that they're found in every single place that, you know, you find Buddhists doing healing, but these are the kinds of you could say patterns or sort of frequently seen themes that arise. So in the first place, there are some basic orientations towards health and healing and the body. These, you can call them, scholarly term for these would be conceptual metaphors. These are kind of like the metaphors or the analogies that kind of like structure a whole system of thinking around something. So some basic orientations within Buddhism, their Buddhist approach to health and healing. We could say, for example, you know, all forms of Buddhism will tend to emphasize the impermanence of the body in some way, the emptiness of the body, you could say, will discuss health and illness within that context as impermanent you know, processes that the body goes through. And so these are kind of basic orientations towards health and healing that become articulated in different ways by Theravada Buddhists, by Mahayana Buddhists, by you know, Tibetan Buddhists. And they'll use different metaphor or different modes of speaking about this, but the underlying basic orientation of health, of illness, as something that is, you know, the body's impermanent. Illness is going to happen sooner or later, and that this is going to be a part of the sort of natural process of being a human being, is different than other medical traditions. You know, there are medical traditions or religious traditions such as Taoism, that where the whole goal is to create an immortal body that will be healthy and live forever. And that's, you know, not, let's say, the usual mainstream Buddhist approach. In a lot of ways, maybe modern medicine is also, you know, particularly when it comes to like cryogenically freezing people into the future and so forth, there is kind of an orientation towards permanence that maybe Buddhist orientations kind of push back against. There are some specific medical doctrines that are widely shared around the Buddhist world. This is less common, I think, than the you know, basic orientation of impermanence, but we could say that in much of the Buddhist world, the idea that the body is constructed out of, or the body is like formed out of earth, water, fire, and wind, at least these four great elements. Often space is included, or void is included as a fifth element. This is a very frequently found medical doctrine. Not so much in East Asia, where now, you know, after the second millennium, the way that people see the body is primarily through qi and yin yang, but throughout a really wide range of Asian cultures, including Tibetan and Thai and Southeast Asian, Mongolian, as well as, you know, in the early Indian scriptures, very common to speak of the body as being composed of earth, water, fire, and wind. Another medical doctrine that is frequently found is the linkage between the winds, or sorry, the way that the winds are considered to be linking between mind and body. So the winds as an intermediary between mental and physical process. Those winds are called, you know, the word wind appears in different languages, lung in Tibetan, lom in Thai. You know, it can take on a number of different sort of locally specific interpretations, but the kind of at the core, there's this basic metaphor of wind as a this bridge between mind and body. So there's a whole range of practices that you will find shared across the Buddhist world. Now, the details vary. The specifics of the ways that these are employed are locally specific. But healing rituals, there are basic structures for healing rituals that you could find shared throughout the Buddhist world. Certain healing type meditations, mantras, breathing techniques. So a lot of other interventions. There's you know, exorcisms, talismans, binding rituals, consecration or empowerment rituals. You find all sorts of different ritual practices and meditations that are shared around the Buddhist world. You know, frequently with differences with local or regional or lineage differences, but there are lots of similarities as well in the sort of overall shape of the range of practices. Some pharmaceuticals, that when you read that word, you're probably thinking like, you know, modern or contemporary, like chemical pharmaceuticals. I'm talking, because I'm a historian of early medicine, I'm talking about specific medicinal products. So it could be herbs, it could be fruits, it could be minerals or animal parts or what have you. And then the material culture is the sort of the way of picking, drying, maybe grinding, you know, burning, or sort of working with those medicinals. So there are some medicinals that are, or pharmaceuticals that are very widespread throughout the Buddhist world. Probably, you know, one that you all might be familiar with is the haritaki fruit, which is or the amalaka fruit. These are two really popular medicinals all around the Buddhist world. They appear in different stories. They appear in iconography. The medicine Buddha holds a haritaki in his bowl. They are, the subject of all kinds of legends and mythologies and so forth. And they also are frequently found, either historically in, historical sites or contemporary in monastic pharmacies. These kinds of panaceas or cure-alls that become very, very popular within the Buddhist tradition and spread all throughout the Buddhist world. Something that I feel is an important kind of contribution of my work is to show how the Buddhist institutions really serve as collecting places for know-how, for medical know-how. Thinking as we were earlier about sort of a network of exchange of different ideas and practices and products and so forth traveling all around Asia, and I was mentioning how the institutions are sort of like the meeting point for all of these people and these things. And you have medical clinics at these institutions, at these large monasteries like Nalanda, let's say, where people are passing through, and the medical knowledge is really kind of like being collected and housed within these institutions. Now, it's not always written down, but at these places you would have oral transmission of knowledge and oral carrying of that knowledge from generation to generation. And I think that continues today in Buddhist institutions around the world, where they serve in not in all cases, but in many cases, these Buddhist institutions that are involved in health and healing serve as kind of collection points for medical know-how. So we're just kind of speaking in general terms, just talking about kind of similarities across the Buddhist world with different, different cultural and local variations. But one similarity is that there are in Buddhist cultures specialist practitioners, or practitioners who specialize in Buddhist therapeutics. So in Thailand, a culture I know really well, there's traditional medicine doctors, and then there's Buddhist healers, and there's some overlap between them, but there's a difference between them. Buddhist healers, or in Thailand, see themselves as being part of a lineage, and this lineage originates with the forest sages, the Buddhist forest sages, or else with Jivaka, the Buddha's doctor. So you would find an analogous case in other Buddhist countries or other Buddhist cultures. In Tibet, there's a similar distinction between a traditional doctor and a Buddhist healer, and different lineages associated with those practices, even though there's lots of overlap. So the practitioners, and the feature that's shared is the kind of the idea that practitioners of Buddhist therapeutics or Buddhist medicine or Buddhist healers see themselves as being specialists in this area, and also as part of a lineage. And usually those lineages are attributed a famous, important, or significant or divine Buddhist founder. Another feature widely shared across Buddhist cultures is narratives about health and healing. There are lots of similarities between the kinds of stories that are told, in Korea about the healing monks' activities in Korea. Lots of similarities between that, text from, I don't know, the 7th century maybe, and then contemporary stories that were being told in China or Tibet or Japan or other parts of the Buddhist world. Frequently similar narrative structure, similar tropes, similar kinds of events, plot lines across these stories. Narratives about wondrous healings, wondrous healers, are found, not only in the scriptures, but also in the oral traditions all around Asia. And there's sort of like frequent themes that will keep emerging from these narratives. And I would say that some of those themes are also found in narratives that contemporary Buddhists are telling. One, just kind of shared theme, we could say, is what happens when a great master dies. Many Buddhist traditions will have a sort of a way of talking about the final days of a great master, whether they're Tibetan or Thai or Taiwanese or Japanese, that emphasize the peacefulness and the control and the compassion with which the great master is dying. Now, that may be entirely true, for the people that were there and they witnessed it. It could be entirely true, but it also is an element of a narrative that then spreads throughout the Buddhist world, and you see the same kinds of like language being used to talk about these great masters. So it's another point of similarity that you can track across the Buddhist world. I hope I'm being clear with that one. So throughout the narratives, but also throughout the scriptures and throughout just kind of Buddhist ways of talking, you also find these shared medical similes, analogies, parables. So it's not just in the narratives of, about wondrous healing monks and other things. It's just kind of like more broadly across the Buddhist cultures more generally, that there is a sharing of these elements of language. So it's entirely routine to refer to the Buddha as a great doctor, or to refer to the Dharma as a great medicine, for example. That's like an extremely common simile or analogy that you can find in basically every Buddhist language and every Buddhist tradition, spoken about perhaps in slightly different ways as it crosses linguistic and cultural barriers. But these kind of core similarities, these core similes or analogies really travel quite widely. So as a scholar of translation that's primarily interested in language and texts, this is one of the things that I'm most interested in. So perhaps it's a little bit kind of like a minor point, but I'm really interested in the way that even when we can't trace texts translating across cultures, you can trace small elements of the way people speak about things, such as similes and analogies and so forth. Beyond that, there are then the texts themselves, larger texts themselves, that are shared across the Buddhist world. So obviously we have different schools of Buddhism with different canons that you're not going to find necessarily, whole sort of, whole collections of texts necessarily moving between the canons. But there are certain texts that have cut across the traditions that you find appearing again and again and again in different places around the Buddhist world. So in the ancient world, one of these, or in the medieval world, one of these really signature texts was the Ashtanga Hridayam, which is a text from India, kind of a synthesis of the Ayurvedic tradition that was produced by author Bhagavata around 600 AD. And this was a text that kind of like drew together all of the Ayurvedic knowledge of that time, the classical Indian medical tradition. So there's some speculation that Bhagavata himself, the author of this text, may have been Buddhist. That's unclear, but there's some speculation about that. In any event, what is clear, what is quite evident from the historical sources, is that Bhagavata's text was extremely influential among Buddhist communities around Asia. So we find the Ashtanga Hridaya discussed in I Ching's text, his report on the Nalanda monastery in India. We find it being a fundamental influence for the Sowa Rigpa tradition. In Tibet, we find a lot of similarities between Ashtanga Hridayam and the Southeast Asian medical traditions that indicate a lot of borrowing out of that text or quoting out of that text. So there's examples like that where we can identify a particularly important text that moves around Asia. There are some scriptures that you could say are perhaps not quite as universal, but that do circulate very widely. The Medicine Buddha Sutra, for example, Vaishajaguru Sutra, for example, is one of those texts that you find circulating very widely around Asia. You find it in Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, Korean contexts, Mongolian contexts, in India also. So, we have certain texts that just really sort of have a very wide circulation and a lot of influence throughout the system. And then the last thing that, in terms of similarities, the last thing I'll just mention is iconography. So depictions of the Medicine Buddha or of Guanyin Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, Chamredzig, iconography of different healing deities or healing figures that travel around Asia and that become sort of like part of this shared world of Buddhist medicine. So before I leave that slide, I just want to emphasize again that I'm talking about, I really emphasize in the book and in my talks and in my thinking, I really emphasize the local distinctions and the cultural differences between these traditions around the world. But at the same time, recognize that there's kind of these elements or these ingredients that do cross-pollinate, that move across Asia, that are interpreted in different ways and maybe have details that are different from place to place, but there's this kind of like shared undercurrent to Buddhist medicine throughout Asia. So, oops. I'm gonna just quickly, this is very quickly on this one. Wanted to just give you a quick sense of the shared repertoire of practices, a little more specific than the last slide gave. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of stuff that are done within Buddhist medicine repertoire for healing. So if you're not familiar with say the Tibetan tradition or another Buddhist tradition, these are the kinds of interventions that you would find within a Buddhist's approach to healing. So there are healing meditations of all kinds. This is something we can get into if you'd like to. Sometimes people think of healing meditation, they think of mindfulness and they think that's a very modern thing. But there is a huge tradition of healing meditations going back for thousands of years within the Buddhist tradition. You also, within a Buddhist approach to health and healing, may find dietary practices. It could be fasting, vegetarianism. It could also be specific kinds of diets for specific kinds of body types. Most of the ancient or the medieval traditions of Buddhism, when they are engaging with Indian medical doctrines, are drawing on the Ayurvedic idea of the tridosha, or the in Tibetan it's the Nyepas, right? So you would have the antidotes for those doshas, and those could be either medicinal antidotes that you take, or it could be some kind of mental, emotional, or even meditation intervention to regulate the doshas. You will find the invocation of healing deities. The specific deities might change from place to place, but the invocation rituals are quite similar. Rituals to empower medicines, water, or other kinds of objects, sometimes healing implements or tools, surgical tools, for example. Exorcisms of ghosts and demons, talismans or amulets to heal or to protect. Binding rites are rites where you take string or some other kind of material, and you often, if you bind the wrists, you might bind other parts of the body in order to secure a cure or to secure the soul to the body, or the guardian spirits to the body. Chanting of scriptures for healing purposes, the incantation of specific dharanis or mantras or names of Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. There's a whole set of rituals for cleansing your karmic, cleansing your karma of misdeeds through sort of repentance or confession or other kinds of ritual interventions. And then finally, there are some surgical procedures that are talked about in Buddhist texts that circulate around Asia in the medieval period. The surgical treatment for cataracts is actually one area that a colleague of mine has spent some time tracking the circulation of texts related to this procedure, and then the actual knowledge of how to do the procedure seems to have been held within Buddhist hands in the medieval period. So anyhow, this is just kind of like if you're wondering what sorts of things would Buddhist healers be up to, this is a kind of a quick list of the kinds of things that we might find being done. So I'm going to just take a drink for a sec. And then I'm going to finish this up by sort of asking the who cares question. So it might be that you're super interested in Buddhist medicine. Maybe you're a practitioner of Buddhism or medicine or Buddhist medicine, and this is just inherently interesting, which is great. But I'm used to speaking to wide groups of scholars and other audiences where the kind of, there isn't like necessarily an inherent interest in the topic of Buddhist medicine. And the question might come up like, okay, so what? Why should we care about this topic? So as a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about for the last 20 plus years, I have some ideas about why this is an important topic that I want to share. And I think I have 8, and I'll go through them relatively quickly. And this is maybe something we can loop back to if you're interested in the Q&A. We can come back to some of these. Just kind of depends on what implications are most interesting to you all as a group. I'm happy to go in whatever direction, but I just kind of want to throw out some ideas. These are all discussed in my book as well, so there's a little more detail in there than I'll do today. But the question is, what kinds of new ways of thinking, or what kinds of new vistas or new perspectives does thinking about Buddhist medicine as a whole, what does this open up for us? So one new perspective is that we might start to recognize Buddhism as having played a major role in the history of medicine. So I said I have a Ph.D. in the history of medicine, and in my field, we had in my graduate school days, we had a whole introduction to history of medicine, and Buddhism was not mentioned once in that history. The history of medicine kind of main topics for the survey course are outlined here. If you're telling the story of the global history of medicine, you go from the ancient world, Hippocrates and Galen in Europe, or Ayurveda and classical Chinese medicine. In the medieval period, you start talking about Islamic medicine. Perhaps, if you're focused on Europe, you might talk about some Christian, monastic things at that point. And then you come to the modern period with the, emergence of modern biomedicine. And in Asia, you have colonial medicine first, and then this Asian medicine revival. And we're just missing in this story the whole piece that I've been talking about of the role of Buddhist medicine, particularly in that first millennium period, as this engine of cross-cultural, cross-pollination and exchange around Asia. We're missing a major part of the story, I think, if historians of medicine aren't aware of the role of Buddhism. So that's important, I think. One important takeaway. The second important takeaway to talk about is, I alluded to this earlier, but in the scholarly world, historians or scholars of medicine really do operate in silos. So you're either studying Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or Sarigpa or Southeast Asian medicine or Islamic medicine or Unani or the Western, early Western Greco-Roman medicine. And people don't tend to, there's a few exceptions, but people don't tend to do any kind of serious study of trans-regional or cross-regional exchange. But, you know, the story that I've been telling here about Buddhist medicine really goes from silos into this whole idea of a globally connected network that cuts across those kinds of categories. So it actually, the reason why scholars are siloed like that makes a lot of sense. It's really hard to learn how to read medieval Chinese and be able to read, you know, the medical texts and stuff like that from that context. And then, you know, if I've spent, you know, a decade learning how to do that, to then spend a decade learning how to read Tibetan medical texts is another kind of, you know, impossible task. For one scholar to be able to do, you know, the kind of networked picture that I'm laying out here is really not possible. And this is why my scholarship has entirely depended on collaborations with other people. I mentioned 85 or 86 other scholars that contributed to those anthologies. You know, people like Jamyang, who took a lot of time to like produce something that was, you know, one piece of this larger puzzle. And you know, that for me, that's been sort of the only way that this kind of global approach has really been able to emerge. So you know, it requires, I think, a change in how scholars are approaching our subject matter. To move from these silos to networks is going to involve not just doing work differently, but collaborating with other people and setting up different kinds of structures than we may be used to. So another perspective or vista that opens up is, for me anyway, my dissertation in my first book was about translation. And for me, this is Buddhist medicine is a really fascinating case of cross-cultural translation. I think there are very few examples of things that spread quite as widely as Buddhism throughout the world, through different cultures, different languages, different contexts. You know, there are other examples. Science is one too that, you know, became global and has spread to many different places and been understood in many different ways. But for the pre-modern period, there's very few things that were as extensive as Buddhism. And looking at one sort of like slice of Buddhism, looking at the medical contents and the way that is translated across different cultures is I think has a lot to contribute to this, to the sort of the theories of translation and theories of cross-cultural exchange. How do people understand those kinds of cross-cultural processes? I think we can learn a lot from studying this case study. Something that I've personally been really interested in as well is kind of how these two categories of religion and medicine start to break down when we engage in studying Buddhist medicine. This is something that I frequently get into debates with other scholars about, but my opinion is that these words, religion and medicine, are modern Western words that we think make a lot of sense when we're talking today, but my opinion is they don't make a lot of sense when it comes to the medieval period, when it comes to medieval China, which is my own area of expertise, when it comes to modern Thailand, which is a place that I had a lot of experience experientially. I don't think these words make a lot of sense when it comes to Buddhist medicine as a whole. When I use the word Buddhist medicine, I know what I'm doing is clumping together or what is considered to be a religion with the word medicine. And I'm kind of doing that on purpose to sort of shake things up a little bit, because I think that making a really rigid distinction between religion and medicine is something that is a false dichotomy. It's probably a false dichotomy today, but it certainly doesn't fit with the reality on the ground in the medieval period, in my opinion. So I like to sort of push back against this this split between religion and medicine through my scholarship, and it's an area that I think is really interesting to think about. What does it mean to really segment out spirituality away from health versus seeing spirituality and health, or religion and medicine, to be part of the same human experience? So I'm interested in the latter, and I know that other people disagree, but that this is something that we can talk more about if you're interested. So another perspective, I said I have 8 of these. This is number 5. Is that I'm sure a lot of you have noticed all the press that mindfulness is getting. You know, this is already as an old picture from 7 years ago, but you know, in the U.S., mindfulness was on the cover of Time magazine in 2014. You know, mindfulness is seemingly everywhere around the English-speaking world. And really today, if you know, take a random person off the street and ask them, you know, what health benefit does Buddhism have? They're almost, you know, 100% chance that they're going to tell you mindfulness reduces stress, right? Or something like that. So one of the perspectives that I think thinking about Buddhist medicine more generally might open up is to kind of like decenter mindfulness as being the only story in town. Certainly the medical benefits of mindfulness are very much worth studying. I'm not detracting from that at all. I think it's wonderful if we're able to, in such a simple and inexpensive and easy to access way, help people with anxiety, depression, and other kinds of ailments and illnesses. And absolutely, we should be doing that. On the other hand, I think thinking about mindfulness as being one piece of a very long, very large, multicultural, diverse tradition of Buddhist medicine starts to kind of open up our perspective much more widely. And we start to wonder about both how does mindfulness fit into Buddhism more generally, but also what else is out there? If mindfulness is part of this larger tradition, what else might be out there that we haven't been studying yet, that we haven't thought about yet in a scientific that we haven't studied in a scientific way yet, right? Another arena, this is kind of harkening back to my Jivaka project, the ethnography in Philadelphia, but sort of also more broadly, looking at, you know, if you're looking at mindfulness, the previous slide, you're really, you know, you're really concentrating on the West. You're concentrating on scholars and scientists and mindfulness practitioners who are primarily white, affluent. It's a very limited population that you're studying or thinking about. Whereas if you reframe in terms of Buddhist medicine more generally, I think you increase the diversity of the number of voices that are in that conversation. So this is one of the interventions that I'm hoping that the Jivaka project does, is just bringing to light lots of additional Asian American voices, immigrant and refugee communities who are engaging in Buddhist healthcare practices or healthcare practices through their Buddhist temples. Many of these interventions or practices involve mindfulness, but many of them don't. And there's, you know, in these different temples, people were telling us about all kinds of traditional medicine interventions, different kinds of food traditions and diet traditions. They were telling us about social engagement, social cohesion, the importance of the Buddhist temple as a place where the community could gather together. Word of mouth spreading health advice and referrals for doctors and so on and so forth. There's just so many ways that Buddhist institutions are kind of shaping modern health-seeking practices today. This is particularly true in a really diverse American city like Philadelphia, but I think is also true, among Buddhist communities worldwide. So I see I flipped 6 and 7 because this I already sort of alluded to when I was talking about number 5, because I thought it was coming next. But the possibility that there's all sorts of other Buddhist interventions that could be scientifically researched is something that I think about a lot. I know we've put a lot of energy into mindfulness, and that research is finally getting somewhere. It's something that's, really starting to become more robust and more important. Other kinds of Buddhist meditations are following behind. We have some emerging interest in researching compassion meditation and other kinds of meditations. But the Buddhist medical tradition, if you think of it as this larger kind of body of interrelated ideas and practices, there's all sorts of stuff that we haven't even begun to think about studying scientifically that should be put on the table. And I would be very interested in sort of seeing the scientific interest in these practices expand. The last kind of broader perspective, is, I think, related to what we're doing right here in this group together. And that is, if you're as a scholar, if you're sort of like very, very, very focused on this hyper specialized topic, and you're researching this one text in this, this very sort of narrow way, and the text has something to do with Buddhist healing, let's say, but you're not aware of this whole kind of like broader picture, then it's easy for you to become myopic and very sort of like, focused on this one thing and not really appreciate the wider implications of the piece that you're working on. So to think about Buddhist medicine as a field with all of these different times and places and cultures and objects and texts and so forth that could be studied by different scholars, but thinking of us as working together within a larger field. And then for that field to not only include the scholars who are working on the scholarship, but also the practitioners who are practicing today and the students who are learning today and the wider community of Buddhists and Buddhist healers and patients of Buddhist healers and so forth that's out there. We move from sort of a myopic scholarly kind of viewpoint to this engagement in a larger collaboration, interdisciplinary, meaning between scholars in different disciplines, and then transdisciplinary meaning beyond the academy to include, practitioners and patients and other people within our collaborations. And so that for me has been kind of a really important thing all along. As Jiaming was saying, like, I've created these kinds of like conference venues and workshops and other kinds of places for these kinds of collaborations to take place. And the books I'm writing are trying to also be conducive towards these kinds of conversations, both among scholars and then also with the broader community of practitioners. And hopefully that's the kind of conversation that we'll be able to have here when I stop talking in just a moment and open up the floor for discussion and Q&A and collaboration together. I'll just finish by just putting up the table of contents for the book, just to give you a sense of what the ingredients here are. So part 1 is sort of a doctrinal approach where I take the 3 main schools of Buddhism, and then the 4th chapter is looking at the commonalities between them, the common ingredients or the common questions between them. then part two is really taking that whole historical arc that we talked about, from the first millennium circulations to translations across cultures to localizations in specific cultural contexts, then the modernization and the contemporary Buddhist medicine. So the first half of the book is sort of thematic. It goes through the different the different yanas, right, in terms of their approaches to health and healing. And then the second part is historical, so going through chronologically. Yeah, and so that is my final slide. I'll just finish by thanking you for your attention and your interest in the topic. And I will say, just, if you take a screenshot real quick or grab my email right there, I would be more than happy to continue the conversation with you beyond today. If you're interested in the books or any of my scholarship, my articles and so forth, there's a website there too. But in terms of my email address, I am happy to communicate with you by email, after today. If you just send me an email, have a question or a reading recommendation or whatever you want. If it comes up, you didn't have a chance to talk about it today, just drop me an email, just remind me where we met, and I'll be really happy to get back to you and continue the conversation after today. So with that, I'm going to stop the share so I can see the chat and see your faces, and we can open up the Q&A and discussion portion of the day. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pierce. That was a great overview and really important last words you were saying about creating a more interdisciplinary. That's one of the main problems and limitations of academia. I find actually this hyper specialization. So really thank you for your great work. And anybody, if you have questions, please jump in. We can have as you see, Pierce is all about sharing ideas. So please don't be shy.
Yeah, and if you are shy and you want to just type it into the chat, that's fine too. I have it open so I can see your question there too. So, so somebody wants to know about the fruits that I mentioned. So there's the amalaka and the haritaki. Those are yeah, there you go. Jamin, do you know what those are in Tibetan? I don't. I should.
Haritaki, I'm not sure about. It sounds Japanese to me, haritaki. It's actually the first time I hear about it. Haritaki.
Let me see. This is, Dr. Google, consulting Dr. Google real quick to see if there's a
Maralaban.
Yeah, Marabalan is like the generic term. These are two different kinds of Marabalan. And yeah, the Wikipedia doesn't have the Tibetan there. I'll look it up. I'll send you.
There's Arura, Barura, Kurura. I might be referring.
Those are them, and I always forget which is which. And
yeah. And then again,
maybe Bilal's going to tell us. Are you going to tell us? Bilal, are you there? I don't know if I'm saying your name right. I'm sorry.
Can't hear them very well.
Yeah, they're muted, so not able to unmute. Oh,
do we have to unmute people? Maybe that's my. Let me see. 1 second. Bilal raised hand. 1 second. Sorry, everybody. Allow participants to unmute. Okay, now you can unmute yourselves. Can you now, Bilal?
Yeah, good.
I can. Thank you very much. Thank you, P.S. That was a wonderful presentation, very engaging. I'm sorry I'm not able to shed any further light on the fruits, but I had a question, and it was related to the final slide about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary discussions, and how the work you've been doing and work other people are doing within the fields of the various traditions of traditional medicine. I mean, I have a little background in Unani medicine, so Unani tib, and I'm seeing a lot of interest arising now in this tradition of medicine. And it's facilitating people looking at themselves and their place in the world and how society should be reordered in a more harmonious and holistic way. So not only are they seeking holistic forms of medicine, because they've become um, almost disassociated from Western modern medicine, but through holistic medicine, they're kind of opening up avenues for them of how life itself should be more holistic. And are you having those kinds of discussions with people maybe in fields of economics or sociology or public health? And if not, do you think that's an avenue that is or could be pursued?
Thank you so much for saying that. That was really, really well spoken. And I do, not in exactly the same terms that you just used, but I very much am, I sort of end this book on exactly that note. Just talking about how Buddhist medicine is an invitation to rethink our own relationship with our health, in terms of our relationship with the environment, with the planet as a whole, with our interconnectedness with all sentient beings and with other people. So I very much am interested in exactly that conversation. I have to say that conversation, I've been having that conversation in groups like this with practitioners and in private with individual scholars. I feel like scholars are not necessarily incentivized to have those conversations in public. Yet I think we may get to a place where people feel comfortable being able to talk about these kinds of things in public, but there's very few scholars that are I think willing to sort of go on the record as, in that way. I will say that of the people that are willing to go on the record in that way, the people that I do have more public interactions with, scholars, it tends to be scholars within the field of Asian medicine who have a background in practice and see themselves as being a bridge sort of between these two worlds. So there is a small cohort of us, a small, group of scholars that I think are, interested in these kinds of conversations. And honestly, there's probably lots of pockets of other scholars out there in other fields that I'm not aware of that are having those conversations too. But specifically within the sort of, Asian religions, Asian medicines kind of circles that I run in, we do have a few, but hopefully that's changing. And it's one of the reasons that I am speaking in the way that I am. And one of the reasons I finished the book the way that I did is because I'm really interested in bringing these two worlds of scholarship and practice together and into some kind of dialogue. And not everybody needs to participate in the same way, but I very much agree with you that this is where we need to be. This is the conversation we need to be having, I think, right now across all of the dimensions of our lives. And if we're not having those kinds of conversations at work, then we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? If we're able to have those kinds of conversations with our friends and our colleagues and our families, but not in public at work, I think we need to change our disciplines. I think we need to change our field. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really look forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you.
And just very quickly, I mean, whenever I've had discussions with people from other disciplines, from academics in other disciplines, be economics, political science, they find it very challenging because it kind of chips away at the roots of their paradigms, and makes them look at the utility of what they're offering and the need for that to be reframed to fit the mold of what people need, rather than trying to bend people to the mold of what is being offered through those disciplines. And in dealing with patients, I've experienced that they find it very empowering to be presented with the idea of health, medicine, sickness, and treatment in this way. They find it so liberating compared to what is offered to them by Western medics. And by Western medics, I don't just mean medics in the West; they can be in the East as well, but within the framework of what we know as Western medicine.
Yeah. I would also say, I mean, maybe we don't need to go on too long about this, but I would also say that that I have seen a real reluctance for practitioners to talk with scholars too, or to take on board scholarly perspectives. For exactly the same reason that you're talking about. I've seen practitioners, whether of Buddhism or of Asian medicine, are reluctant to engage in the kinds of critical perspectives that scholars are bringing to the table, precisely for the same reason, because it chips away at the worldview that the practitioners have, right? So I think we have two bodies, two groups of people who each are specializing in their own areas, whose perspectives are sometimes in direct conflict with each other, whose perspectives may chip away at the legitimacy of each other. And for the most part, these two groups, the scholars and the practitioners, have avoided really engaging with those questions when they come together, in order to sort of preserve the peace between the two. So I've written a couple blog posts recently in the last year or two on the sort of like those kinds of like transdisciplinary dynamics when practitioners and scholars get together. And just for me, this is one of the areas that I'm involved in right now. I usually speak, for some reason, I've usually been speaking with Chinese medicine practitioners about this, but really kind of like doing the kind of bridge work that allows both groups of people to be challenged, to have their worldviews challenged fundamentally, and still feel like that exchange is really productive and expanding. So I don't know, this may be a whole other topic for a whole other time, but I do feel like when I say transdisciplinary conversations, like that's what I'm talking about. Not just that we're all going to get along and everybody will have the same perspective and we'll all be, friends, but some of it might involve tension and argumentation, and that would be a good thing too, if the end result is that we all become more, like you said, more holistic in our thinking, or more human. We all become more human rather than just like staying in our little small worlds that we've comfortably sitting in. But anyway, thank you, Bilal. These are great. I mean, I just love the direction you've taken this in, so really appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. I look forward to reading your blogs. Are they on your website?
Yeah, on my website. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So Christopher asked a question in the chat a little bit ago, to ask about my perspective on Buddhist medical responses to COVID. So the epilogue to the book was written, I think, in the middle of 2020. Might have been towards the end. And I did address some of the Buddhist responses to COVID in the book. It was a little bit early, right? So we weren't at the point where the pandemic was really fully kind of, we didn't have a vaccine at that point. So it's perhaps now a little bit outdated, but the medical responses to COVID, the Buddhist responses to COVID, I wrote I wrote a blog about this as well, and wrote in the epilogue that I think they were very much in keeping with sort of the Buddhist medicine tradition. It's the broader kind of phenomenon that I've been talking about here, in the sense that there was a lot of talk at the time, and I cited articles and blog posts by different Buddhist leaders, but there was a lot of talk at the time that emerged about ethics, about Buddhist values, about interdependence and compassion and generosity, right? These kinds of like Buddhist values, and I connected that with like this very long tradition of Buddhist medicine, that these are sort of the values that have been at the heart of this tradition. You know, why are Buddhists involved in healing in the first place? Has a lot to do with these kinds of like, you know, bodhisattva values and so forth. There was a lot of talk when in the early days of COVID about different kinds of talismans or rituals or invocations or empowerments that could protect people. You know, whether it's like, I saw masks in Thailand that had like talismans printed all over them. I saw you know, tweets from Japanese temples with like, you know, talismans and so forth. So a lot of these, you know, were very very, you could say, predictable responses from within the ritual repertoire that we talked about earlier, right? These were you know, Buddhists were drawing on the repertoire and modifying those rituals to specifically meet the needs of COVID, but they were you know, lots of similarities there. Meditation was a major theme. The need to do meditation for to be balanced and centered and reduce your stress and be able to be more beneficial to others. And there were some organizations that were talking about, you know, if we could get enough people to meditate around the world at the same time, that the positive effects of that mass meditation movement would lessen the impact of the virus. So there were those kinds of like, you know, interventions as well. The same deities that we would predict were the ones that people were appealing to, right? Medicine Buddha, Avalokiteshvara, you know, these you know, healing, traditional kind of healing deities, Tara, you know, et cetera, were being mentioned a lot. So I think there was a lot of kind of similarities between the COVID response and the kinds of things that I've been talking about here. On the other hand, another similarity is that, you know, there wasn't one coherent Buddhist response. It's not like Buddhists all over the world said the same thing, right? And that's also characteristic of Buddhism, right? That it's so diverse. There's so many different cultural and national and linguistic kind of variation within the tradition, that there was all kinds of different perspectives coming out. Some people very much saw the virus through a biomedical lens as a virus, and some people saw it as a demon, and some people saw it as, you know, bad karma. So there was all kinds of different interpretations around it, which is also Buddhist, right? That's also the diversity of the tradition informs the diversity of those responses. So it was kind of like a little bit of both. In my opinion, that was my response. So I'm just checking the chat to see. Okay, that's a separate question. So is it Premila? I don't know how to say your name. Go ahead. You can jump in.
Hi, yeah, it's just to follow up on on what you were talking about regards responses to COVID. I was wondering, did you come across any sort of strange anti-vaxxing narratives that somehow kind of, you know, took in certain Buddhist worldview systems? A bit like, you know, for example, in America, you had you know, there were all these viral videos going around about how the vaccine had an element called luciferase and therefore it was demonic, and, you know, so how like, oh, and then, you know, it was the mark of Satan and whatnot. And so, you know, these kind of came into anti-vaxxing stories. Were there any sort of Buddhist anti-vaxxing narratives that you might have come across?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, you all would know more about that than I would. I imagine you all are pretty well connected with Buddhist circles too. I definitely heard. So I'm speaking not only about Buddhist medicine practitioners, but Asian medicine practitioners more generally, split on this issue. You saw like a really interesting phenomenon where you know, that group is usually, not always, but like on many issues, is usually sort of like of the same political opinion. But the vaccine issue split that group right down the middle, and very strongly so, where you had a faction of Asian medicine practitioners who were of the opinion that, you know, vaccines are unnatural, and, you know, they went against the sort of like natural kind of ethos of Asian medicine. And then you had another group of people who were very much, you know, in favor of using vaccines, and even argued that they were natural. And vaccines were, you know, apparently the whole idea of inoculating people was actually invented in China. So you know, in the medieval period at some point. So there was that kind of like debate taking place within those communities. And I saw Buddhist healing practitioners part of that discussion, taking both sides. So that's kind of just my vista on it. But I think probably, you know, I don't know, if we did a survey of everybody in this room, we probably would find that you all, being parts of different Buddhist communities and different social networks, probably, you know, saw, you know, your own kind of version of that story. Yeah, so I didn't do like a some kind of like qualitative study or survey or something like that to measure people's responses like that. I did reach out to a number of people to ask a couple of questions about specifically about like COVID, and the people that I reached out to, so one frequent response, or yeah, I guess one frequent response was from Buddhists, was that their emphasis on compassion made them more compliant towards getting the vaccines, or more not compliant, that's not the right word, more enthusiastic to get the vaccines. So that they frequently responded saying that their decision to get vaccinated was based on sort of a calculation of what's best for the largest number of sentient beings. So that's something I can say I did hear from a number of my respondents when I reached out to them. Let's see. So I hope that was enough of an answer. I'm sorry, I don't have more detail for you. So I have in the chat, oh, it was a private chat from Lama Chosang saying that you wanted to make a comment. So you're welcome to, please. And then I see the other questions. I'll get to those in a sec.
You have to unmute yourself. I think you're not unmuted.
Right now, can I? Yes. Yes, good afternoon, and really thank you for a really interesting session there. My interests have always been in Himalayan medicine, and I've been to various conferences, you know, Bhutan, Ladakh, and etc. And it's my particular interest is where karma comes into all this with all medicine, in the sense of if an aspirin could cure a headache, we'd only need aspirin. We wouldn't need any other medications. And that goes right across the board. So I'm always really interested in how to get across to non-Buddhists as well as Buddhists about helping them ways with the karma, so that you can actually really take full advantage of the medication or the treatments they're receiving. And that interrelation between that reliance on one's karma for it to work. And I think within this, we've got a lot to offer the world.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for making that comment. I have a little section in the book where I talk about karma, and I think we can say it's universally true among Buddhists that they're interested in the relationship between karma and health. How specifically that relationship is described is probably different, but from tradition to tradition, and you know, text to text and so forth. And so my response is really just based on sort of my own kind of like knowledge of the texts and the scholarship that I've read. And I think there is, I mean, obviously there's the overarching theory that ultimately what happens to your body relates to karma, right? The body that you're in and its predispositions and its, you know, longevity and all of that ultimately relates to karma. But then there's like, so that's like the ultimate cause, but then there's like the proximal cause, the immediate cause of the illness. And there are some scriptures where the Buddha, you know, lists karma on a list of causes of illness, right? He includes like the doshas and other things, but and then karma. And so there's like this kind of category of, we could say, karmic illness that Buddhists have recognized, Buddhists in many traditions have recognized. And a karmic illness is one, usually like the definition of a karmic illness is it's an illness that cannot be cured using the medicines prevailing in the time and place where you live. So it's ultimately, that is a, you know, it's just a matter of your karma that, you know, you've got this illness that will not be able to be cured. But then you have the whole range of like emergency karma clarification, karma purification rituals, right? Which different traditions will have different ones, but they all have one where you, or multiple, where you can pull in these, you know, deity invocations or what have you in order to purify the karma. And then there's all the miracle stories about how those rituals have worked, right? So there's kind of like a mixed bag of you know, admonitions against, you know, the effects of bad karma, and then emergency rituals that can nullify that karma. The idea of the karmic illness is the thing that can't be cured, but then like the promise that perhaps it could be cured using these more extreme means. And just that all of that is out there, right? And in the discourse and in the conversation, and different Buddhists and different types of Buddhism and different Buddhists themselves kind of like interpret all of that differently from one another. So I don't know that there's like a, you know, a Buddhist, one single Buddhist kind of like tradition around that topic, other than just to like think a lot about it and discuss it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of
yeah,
it's kind of a wishy-washy answer,
yeah.
right?
Well, no,
as a
it's,
medical practitioner myself in the past, right? It's these kind of like wishy-washy scholarly answers to me were always like, yeah, but what do I do for the patient, right? So this isn't like that. It's not to say that there is an answer from me about what's for the patient. Sorry.
Well, I don't think it's just one answer. It's just that interest of trying to use a language, especially to those who are not Buddhist, in an acceptable way that it can enhance their karma, even if they don't realize it's their karma, so that they can actually have a better outcome from the medication or their procedures. And I really find that quite interesting, doing that, you know, within an interfaith perspective, or even to people that don't have any faith. And I often do that, and it's just quite a fascinating way of behaving on what's acceptable. So when you talk about Kabat-Zinn bringing in mindfulness, it's been written in such a way now that anybody in the street more or less knows what, well, they have an idea what it means. It's a question, I feel, that karma can be brought more into things in that way. And everybody believes in karma one way or another. Doesn't matter what they call it, whether you reap what you sow or what goes around comes around. So it's working on that to enhance people's opportunities without them having to, without me having to say, oh, it's a Buddhist practice. That's what I was sort of getting, just sharing that one with you, really.
Yeah, that's lovely. I think that's really important. Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I'm thinking about like, there's like the psychosocial, right, or the biopsychosocial, right, is like the medical term that you could use, or there's like the placebo effect, or, you know, there's other ways of talking that aren't satisfactory either, right? Like to trade karma, one of those instead of karma would create a whole bunch of other problems. But yeah, I think that's a great point, and a really interesting conversation to have around like how do we language that for the ordinary person on the street. Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
Well, if anybody follows that through, do keep me in contact. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, me too.
You never know. A new movement about to start.
So all right, so I'll just move over to the chat. Let's see, the from CN Go, the Buddhism is very often considered not to be a religion, which is a concept imposed by Abrahamic Western philosophers on a foreign living science. Okay. Would this understanding change your work on Buddhism and medicine? Okay, so yeah, so this is the point, one of those vistas, I forget which number it was, but just of challenging the categories of religion and medicine. I see you also threw in philosophy and science. I would challenge all of those categories. So it's possible that in some pre-modern cultures, there were concepts that might be somewhat analogous to our words, religion, philosophy, science, and medicine. It's possible that there were words in China or ancient India or what have you that carved out these kind of like different domains. But I think it's really unlikely that those domains were carved out nearly with the exclusivity that they have today. So for example, today in English, in the English language, when we say religion and science, you know, we're using those terms in a context of like, you know, at least 600-700 years of tension and war and strife between the church and and science, right, over the boundaries between those terms. What is inside science and outside science? What is religion? What isn't religion? Right? These are terms that when we use those terms right here in this group in English, we are inescapably like having this conversation against that background, and that's a Western and a modern background. And so the terms, you know, that I would encounter in a medieval Chinese text, for example, while there may be some superficial, perhaps, similarity with some of these terms, religion, philosophy, etc., they can't possibly have the same implications for medieval China that those words have for us in the modern world. So Buddhism is very often considered to not be a religion. Sure, I could make that argument. Buddhism is considered to be a religion. Sure, I can make that argument too. I think what's most important is to think like that word, because religion, because of its modern context, doesn't really actually capture very much about Buddhism. And in my opinion, it muddies the water more than it clarifies. So that's one, yeah, that's kind of maybe a different direction than you were wanting me to go in, but that's kind of my response to that, is just that these categories are too restrictive and too culturally specific and too modern to really be useful for us in the pre-modern context. So I kind of like avoid them, or I make my own categories, or I mush things together, or I use a word like medicine and then kind of like say exorcism is medicine too, right? Which kind of like blurs up that category. I don't know if you want to respond to that, CN. If you want to say anything else in the chat, please go ahead. I'm going to move down to Carol's question. So I know highly qualified shiatsu and homeopathic practitioners working within the NHS or NHS funded institutions who've been fascinated by seeing actual Tibetan medicine balls, who would be delighted to have cross-cultural professional interaction. I think these interactions could be facilitated, especially around discussions of mental health, and look forward to that future. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I think could be really productive. You know, these kinds of these kinds of conversations across different silos, I think the more the better, for all the reasons that Bilal was bringing up earlier. I would push back a little bit against the just the mental health component. Like I understand what you're saying, and I agree. I think that would be easier to have that conversation in the mental health arena. And we should start there probably. But on the other hand, you know, just kind of to go back to the previous question that I was talking about, like in a modern society where we have science carved out over here and religion carved out over there, when religion has a conversation with science, it often is just like in the mental health area. right? Like, okay, we'll make a space for you, religion, within our biomedical hospital. You, religion, can have an opinion about mental health, but you can't have an opinion about physical health. That's beyond your domain because you're religion, and that's not scientific, right? So I maybe I would suggest like starting there, but then trying to kind of like move across that divide, and really like have a more a more intertwined dialogue than just sort of like staying in one silo. And like I was saying earlier to in response to Lama just saying I think the the biopsychosocial or placebo effect, like these are domains within science where there is actually a demonstrated effect of mental, spiritual, kind of religious values and ideas on the physical body. There is a place that has been carved out, like a plug-in that we could engage in these kinds of conversations if we skillfully know how to navigate those concepts. I'm not a scientist, so that's not my area. I don't necessarily do these kinds of dialogues myself, but I would point towards start with the mental health, but then like get into the kind of biopsychosocial, placebo effect, those kind of areas where you can then sort of like have a more serious conversation about other dimensions of health other than just mental health. And I don't mean that to discount mental health. It's super important. Hopefully what I said makes sense. And Carol, you can feel free to jump in or follow up in the chat too, if you're still here. I'll just go to Glenn's question. Glenn says, great talk. What were the biggest influences on Buddhist medicine? I mentioned Tridosha from Ayurveda. What about pre-Buddhist traditions, Bun, shamanic traditions, etc.? So it depends. It kind of depends on where exactly you're talking about. So the biggest influences on the Indian Buddhist medical material is Ayurvedic ideas. You also have Indian tantric ideas, right? The channels and chakras and winds and so forth. Not in the Pali, but in later Buddhist writings in India. And those, when they spread from India, they introduced the rest of Asia to these models, right? So the rest of Asia gets like the earth, water, fire, and wind model from Ayurveda, the Tridosha from Ayurveda, and the subtle body system model, from tantric texts. So that you could say, when I was saying that Ayurveda was a major influence, that's what I'm talking about. And also the circulation of the Ashtanga Hridayam text around Asia as well. But then locally in different places of Asia, you would have a lot of other influences locally that combine along with what is being received from India. So in Tibet, certainly in Tibet, pre-Buddhist shamanic traditions, spirit healing traditions and so forth become part of what is foundational to Sowa Rigpa. Just like in Thailand, the pre-Buddhist, animist, spirit-based religious traditions and healing traditions become part of what's done in Thailand. And likewise everywhere else, right? So it kind of depends on where you're talking about, what the major influences are. If you're in East Asia, like I was saying today, the primary framework for Buddhists to talk about health and healing in East Asia is no longer the Indian models, but it's actually Qi and Yin Yang and Wuxing and the other kinds of Chinese, indigenous, Chinese ideas. And then in the modern period, science is kind of like, everywhere is a major influence. Buddhists all over Asia are interested in claiming scientific validation for Buddhist practices. That's very much, at least in the 19th and 20th century, that was very much a marker of legitimacy or a marker of in many countries it became illegal to practice unless you had sort of the validation of the scientific, the board or the certification organization or what have you. Yeah, so these are all, I think, major influences that are shaping Buddhist medicine. Some of them are trans-regional and some of them are very local. I hope that answers the question, Glenn. You can definitely jump in or throw something in the chat or whatever.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question if possible.
Yeah.
Unless I missed it, I don't think you mentioned astrology in your list of sort of influences and components of Buddhist medicine, which I keep on seeing. I'm actually asking this also because in June I set up a talk about Vedic astrology, and I believe in East Asia, probably from the Khmer tradition, Thailand, Cambodia, it's quite an important element as well. And what I find very interesting is often how certain elements which wouldn't be considered Orthodox Buddhist, sort of local indigenous, somehow get incorporated and accepted as well. So I'm just wondering if astrology is Pan-Asian, if it's still considered, because I know in Tibetan medicine, for example, the famous Mensikan, it means exactly men is medicine, Tsi is calculations, astrology. So it's really considered a block. We don't hear much about it, but it's a very important thing. And it sort of ties in with karma and all that as well in some other parallel way. So I'm just curious if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Jameng. I appreciate that. I in putting in however many slides I could put in to do this presentation, I should have put in another one that I didn't put in, that I wish I did. And that's the sort of the whole area of arts and sciences that are kind of like overlapping with medicine, but are sort of like, also considered to be separate fields or separate arenas, right? So astrology is definitely one that is like very much overlapping with medicine, in the sense that a lot of I'd probably say all, but I can't speak for every single astrological tradition because I haven't looked at all of them, but I would, every one that I know of has a health component to it. And then some kind of remediation that you can do by like offering to the stars or prayers to certain deities or whatever, to regain your health or to protect against illness. So for sure, astrology is a although the majority of astrology doesn't have to do with health, that there is that kind of overlap there. I think another similar field is alchemy. So lots of overlaps with medicine in terms of like production of alchemical medicines and elixirs and so on and so forth. So although the majority of the alchemical field doesn't deal with health, there is, a significant component that does, that overlaps as well. Yeah, so I martial arts is another field. I have a whole list of bullets that, like, these kind of like a Venn diagram, right? You would have sort of like the circle of all of these different traditions kind of overlapping slightly with medicine, although there's a larger field of practice there. So yes, I'll next time I won't skip that slide, but I really appreciate the comment. Yeah, and once you start working on Buddhist medicine as a scholar, like it becomes really hard to know, like, okay, where do I draw the line? Like this book's going to be like 1,000 pages long if I go into all of those things, right? So at a certain point, I just was like, okay, these are like the auxiliary fields or the adjacent fields that have some overlaps, but I need to sort of like not go into all the details there, or else I'm just gonna get lost, right? So anyway, that's why I didn't bring them in, but I really appreciate you bringing it out in the comment, though.
Thank you so much, Piers, for everything. And I believe we don't have any more questions in the chat now. No, everybody is thanking you very much.
Well, unless I skipped anybody, which just let me know if I did. I don't think I did.
So thank you again. Thank you, Piers, and have a lovely day, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Good to see everybody. And yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. I'm really happy to continue the conversation.